Good morning and welcome to Sunday morning at the Marxist Library. I'm Roger Harris. I'm with the Institute for the Critical Study of Society. The ICSS is the group that brings you the Sunday mornings at the Marxist Library, and we've been doing that for 15 years, every Sunday morning. To find out more about our programs, we urge you to go to our website. It's ICSS Marx. I imagine most of you know how to spell MARX, .org, and find out about our programs. We also have our past programs on the website, and we urge you to sign up and get our notices for the programs, and also to give us feedback on the programs that we are doing and suggestions for new programs. Today's program is on Mexico, and I would be remiss not to mention that I am broadcasting from California. California was once part of Mexico. In fact, 55% of the sovereign territory of Mexico was stolen by the Yankees. 55%. Mexico is a very important country, but it's one that does not get nearly as enough recognition in the US. Mexico is now the second largest trading partner of the United States, eclipsing China, and second only to Canada. Mexico is also, and I'm a biologist, and something probably most of you don't know, but Mexico is one of the most biodiverse countries in the world. It's one of the five most biodiverse countries, ranking up with Brazil, China, Colombia, and Indonesia. 2.5 times the biodiversity of Costa Rica, for instance. And for us who are politically active, Mexico is also the home of the first of the great 20th century revolutions. It preceded the Russian Revolution. And for today, we're going to hear about the fourth transformation and what that is in Mexico by our speaker, José Luis Granados Ceja, a person who's uniquely qualified to address that question. He is a journalist and activist located in Mexico City. So, José Luis, it's all yours.
Okay, great. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you to everybody who's tuning in right now. It's really good to be able to share this time with you and have this conversation. I try to never say no to an opportunity to talk to a group of people about solidarity, about the situation in Mexico. Because as Roger said, unfortunately, it doesn't get the attention it deserves. And I think part of that is strategic. I think our class enemies very much understand that if people paid more attention to Mexico, it might actually inspire some people to take some ideas from the successes that I think have been able to be secured here in Mexico. But also because I think the role of international solidarity is indispensable. And I think in particular, when we look at what are the actual mechanisms, what are actual forces that are limiting the expansion of socialist thought, socialist governance, bringing us closer to a Marxist utopia, I think it's precisely US imperialism. And I think we need to be talking about it more frequently. Why did I say that? So Roger mentioned that I'm a Mexican journalist born here in Mexico City, but I was raised in the United States and Canada, and I've been back since 2018. Basically came back to be able to participate in whatever way I could in the transformation of this country right before López Obrador was elected. But I've been doing international solidarity with Latin America for many years now. In fact, I became an activist in a kind of more serious way in 2005 when I went to Venezuela for the World Festival of Youth and Students. And so I've been doing Venezuela solidarity work for a long time, which I know that many people in this room have likely also been involved with as well, since about then, so almost 20 years at this point. And I always kind of start my interventions by talking a little bit about a self-criticism, doing an exercise of saying, I think while a lot of the work was very admirable, and I don't want to, diminish the very important efforts that we all did at one point or another in terms of, helping the world understand what's happening in Venezuela, defending it from imperialism and things like that. Ultimately, I think in a lot of ways we weren't successful, right? We weren't able to actually affect the ability of imperialism to constrain the Bolivarian Revolution. And so if we look at that experience, and that's not to say that we should walk away from it, I think there's still very important work there. I work for Venezuela Analysis. I'm a staff writer. Some of you may recognize my voice if you listen to the Venezuela Analysis podcast. But I think we should draw the lessons from that experience and try to focus on how do we best intervene in terms of building solidarity with Mexico, with the process here. What is the role of internationalists, like the people who are assembled in this room virtually, and what is sort of the most effective way that we can actually affect change to impede the actions of imperialism. And I think precisely the people who are drawn to an event like this in the Marxist cafe, I think are exactly the kind of people I want to be talking to. So it's always a privilege for me to be able to do that, and to be able to do it in certain terms that I think, if I'm doing an event with a more kind of a broad audience, maybe I can't get into some of the specifics, but I think I'm going to, take some liberties here and speak things in a terminology that I think we all have share in common. So I prepared a little presentation. It's one I've presented before, so I'll move through it relatively quickly, but it helps me kind of frame things and establishes at least a kind of a common ground for everybody. So let me just share my screen. Okay. And let me make this smaller because it's distracting. Okay, so the title of this, so I mean, we're talking about Mexico in a lot of ways, and I think I'm going to spend a little bit more time also talking about the actual election now that the official election period has begun here in Mexico. But this allows us to kind of have a starting point. I have, like I said, at least some common ground. And I call it the role of international solidarity, basically when I just finished sharing with all of you, which is that I think the people in this room are exactly who we need to be having these conversations with in order to be able to be more effective in terms of limiting the actions of imperialism. I think in particular in Mexico, it's an opportune moment to be able to do so. So the political reality of Mexico. I'll go through this quickly because I imagine many of you are likely familiar with this. But so 2018, López Obrador on his third try, so he ran in 2016, 2012, 2006, 2012, and 2018. 2006 was a curious exercise because most of the parliamentary left in Mexico understand that was an electoral fraud. So even though Felipe Calderón was able to consolidate that fraud, it's not viewed as a legitimate election amongst us who sympathize with the left. Nonetheless, he didn't actually take office. He runs again in 2012, and it was all kinds of illegal campaign financing, really kind of borders on the same kind of accusation of fraud. The National Electoral Institute probably should have taken much stronger steps. But again, nonetheless, Peña Nieto was elected in 2012. And I think those last two sexenios, as we call them here in Mexico, last two administrations, really kind of put things very clear for the population. It became very clear that there was a regime that was ruling this country, that this regime had two parties, but nonetheless the same policies, the PRI and the PAN, that varied very, very little between them. I think the massive corruption and the way that corruption was deeply embedded in the practice of doing politics in this country. I think a lot of people kind of woke up to the reality of the country in 2018, and that's why you see this landslide election. So López Obrador, an important figure in the electoral left in this country for many, many decades, really kind of gained national prominence, obviously, in the year 2000, when he is elected the governor of Mexico City, or the equivalent, jefe de gobierno, and, kind of implements a very progressive kind of administration. And it was very much assumed that he would run for presidency to try to carry some of these policies into the national office. And as I explained, ended up facing some fraud. So he wins in 2018, over 30 million votes, beats nearest rival by 30 points. So all that to say is that it was very, very much a mandate. I have a quote here from Edwin Ackerman, and he says in this article that I always recommend when I do these presentations, I'll share it in the chat at the end, but he says the parties that dominated the political field throughout the neoliberal period were suddenly reduced to rubble. So it's not just that Morena, López Obrador's political party, which he founded in 2014, it's not just that they win, is that they win in a kind of really making a statement kind of way. So they get a comfortable majority in both houses of Congress. There's a bicameral Congress here in Mexico. And you will see here on this map, so this is the most recent one, for what are the states being governed. So since 2018, Morena, again, López Obrador's party, has won a majority of the races here, almost all of them, save for 3 or 4. And now they control 22 out of 32 federal entities, so the states and Mexico City. You can see on the map clearly a very strong representation of the party. Now, they're not, different governors represent kind of different currents, I would say, within Morena. Some are better than others. And we just had the Women's Day demonstration here in Mexico. The governor of Zacatecas is a Morena governor and engaged in repression. So, they're not all the same, but it's still pretty significant. And I mention it always because I think it tells us that it's not a flash in the pan. It's not just a brief aberration that things will return to the status quo that existed before 2018. I don't think that's the case whatsoever when it comes to Mexico. I think one of the key things to keep in mind as we go through this presentation is that the opposition is operating under that logic, under that assumption that things will go back to quote unquote normal relatively soon. And I think that's actually informed their strategy and why they've done so poorly. I think we at the Mexico Solidarity Project, myself and my own personal analysis, kind of consider the 2018 election a watershed moment. There's a before and there's an after. And what's happening in Mexico is significant and rises, I think, in terms to the degree of us being able to call it revolutionary change. It's not the kind of language that's used by Morena or the leadership, but I do think that if we do a materialist analysis of the situation, we'll conclude that it is rupturing with the old order, which I think rises to the kind of political change that we could classify as revolutionary. And so, like I said, the opposition hasn't been able to kind of articulate a good response to this reality. They keep thinking that they will return to power. They kind of view it almost as if it's their birthright. They are the ones who are meant to rule this country. They did it for such a long time. I think in particular, it's important when I talk about the old regime to basically, I'm talking about the 80s up until 2018. That's the neoliberal period. Even though there was a quote unquote democratic transition in the year 2000, when the PAN is elected nationally, the PAN ends up needing the PRI to rule. It's kind of where we start to see the emergence of what we now here in Mexico call the PRIAN, and what I call the old regime or the ancien regime. And so what we were seeing now is, like I said, this watershed moment, a very different kind of Mexico. And to kind of keep in mind, López Obrador can't run for re-election. So he's constitution prohibited. He was not interested in changing the constitution. I think if he tried, he probably would have been able to get it. In order to be allowed to run, he has insisted that actually when his term ends this September, at the end of September, he's going to retire from politics. He said he wants to go to his ranch. He wants to mostly write books. He says he doesn't really want to intervene, and I think also doesn't want to cast a shadow over the new administration. So moving, I think it's important to talk about, like, what has been the impact, right? We can talk a lot about, ideas and, this being a watershed moment and all these kinds of things. But I think it's also kind of important to highlight the fact that in terms of policy, there's been some very significant changes that I think are worthy of attention. And I think in particular for a US audience would also resonate with them. So if we had to sum it up, I would say that what's happening in Mexico under the leadership of López Obrador is an anti-neoliberal, so explicitly so. So even though neoliberalism is a bit of a contested term, and one of the things that the extra parliamentary left here says is that you can't decree the end of neoliberalism, to which I would agree that they're right. You can't just say neoliberalism is over. I think very much in terms of how public policy is being carried out. So you're not seeing kind of the pillars of neoliberal orthodoxy being abided by so much. There are some instances where you could say that, yes, it is, in the sense that, not running, the government didn't run deficits for the first 5 years. This last one they will. Sort of macroeconomic stability, independence of the central bank, all these kinds of things are still very much in place. But in terms of the types of social programs, ones that are directed in a universal sense, universal social programs, that there aren't necessarily supports as much as there used to be for major industry, where, if we understood that neoliberalism is also not so much the shrinking of the state, but a reorientation of the state to serve the interests of the bourgeoisie. I think there's been very much a reversal of that, which I think is pretty significant in terms of now the orientation of the state is very much one that is aiming to put the poor first, as he says. I think it's important. I think in a lot of ways that slogan really sums it up, right? Which is por el bien de todos, primero los pobres, which is for the good of all, the poor come first. And so this emphasis on attending to the needs of the majority poor population, those living under in extreme poverty, but also kind of ruling for the working class majority and the campesino majority that exists in this country. How has that been manifested? I think one of the ones that is important to highlight is the massive expansion of direct cash transfer programs. So the most popular one being the pension for seniors. So every 2 months, seniors get approximately $300 a month, which is not a lot of money, obviously, but it's a life-changing amount of money for a lot of people. I think I was preparing an article this past week and I came across this older piece from the Los Angeles Times, which was actually pretty funny, how the mainstream media really can't wrap its head around what's happening in this country, and quite literally the topic or the title of the article was something like, why is López Obrador so popular? Well, it's because he's implemented universal social programs where people who used to have to bag groceries at the supermarket or beg their families or beg on the streets or, far past the point where they should have retired, continue working, no longer find themselves in that circumstance because of this program in particular, the universal pensions for seniors. And they are universal, right? Anybody who is of age, I believe the age right now is 70, and there's some proposals about lowering it to 65. Anybody who's 70 years old automatically qualifies, can go and sign up and receives that bi-monthly stipend. And there's even been cases of people who are very strongly affiliated with the opposition going to and lining up and collecting their pension, as they should, because it's a universal program. Because I think that's been one of the ways that they've broken from the kind of the neoliberal logic of before, that programs need to be basically needs-based and sort of targeted. No, it's a very different kind of approach. And there's a lot more. There's Jóvenes Construyendo Futuro, which is basically kind of like an internship, paid internship program so that young people can have their first job and start their careers. There's been expansion of supports for students so that they get universal support so that they can focus on their studies at basically from the primary all the way up into higher education. I'm no longer in my coursework, but I'm still finishing my thesis. And while I was doing coursework, I received a monthly stipend of 14,000 pesos a month so I could focus full time on my studies. And my program, Human Rights, was not the program that usually got the support from these kinds of government scholarships. But there was a reorientation to say that, no, we need to support, not just the sciences, not just the productive, not just engineering, but also humanities and social sciences. And so it's just one example of some of these things. To the degree that, and this actually might be a little bit out of date, but as of last year, 71% of Mexican households benefited from at least one social program. So that means that in 7 out of 10 households, you would find somebody who's either receiving a pension or is enrolled in a scholarship program or is in the tree planting program, which is so like the actual reach, the expanse of the social programs is immense. And I think that's also really important. And then finally, which is one that I think cannot go unsaid, which is poverty reduction. So what we've seen is, for the first time in a long time, a massive decrease in poverty. And you can see it there at the very end of the chart that I have up on the screen. In 2018, there's a little bit of an uptake because of the pandemic in 2020, but then we see total poverty drop to the tune of 9 million. So from 2020 to 2022, and that's continuing to drop, 9 million people. I recently did a tour in the United States and I told people, it's basically the population of Los Angeles, right? Or it's the population of Mexico City. So it's a huge amount. It's the size of some countries. An extraordinary amount of people lifted out of poverty. So not only are these programs universal, but they're also effective, right? And that's part of the story of what's happening in Mexico, is that people's lives are being changed. The material differences are evident to everybody who's working class. And I think that's also why you see such a virulent, such an aggressive attitude from the opposition, because how do you contend with that? How do you contend with the fact that 71% of households are receiving social programs, right? Where people are being lifted out of poverty. People can tell you, like that article I mentioned in the LA Times, it's obvious to anybody who's from down here, who's from below. People like me, I'm a working class guy. Even though I speak fluent English, all this kind of stuff, I don't have rents. I didn't inherit any property. I live off of my labor power. So, and even then, I'm in a relatively privileged position, living in the capital and, you know, having stable employment, et cetera, et cetera. The point of that being is that the lives of working class people of the majority of this country have improved, and it's indisputable. And then for most people, when they go and they think about who are they going to vote for, are they going to vote for the old regime that made life harder but offered more quote unquote opportunities, or are they going to support this regime, this government, this party, which has delivered very real results? It's something to always keep in mind, and it's the kind of thing that the opposition, because they live in a bubble and they're listening to very, very hate-filled pundits who loathe López Obrador and Morena and everything they stand for, again, because they think that they are the ones who should be running the country. They hate that somebody from below is sitting in the president's chair, are very wrong. They are unable to understand that because they move in these bubbles and they don't actually interact with the majority of this country. So next, one of the things I also like to talk about is that under this administration, this has probably been the most labor-friendly government probably since the 30s, since Lázaro Cárdenas. So the minimum wage in this country has doubled in real terms, so not just in nominal terms, since 2018. So you can see this chart at the right here. The one at the top is nominal terms. It's now in 2024, almost 250 pesos a day. So that's how minimum wage works in Mexico. It's not by hour, but by day. So 250 pesos a day, and in real terms is 185. So you can see it increased by 100 pesos. It doubled as of 2023 and 2024. It took effect in January. And, you know, the argument was always like that it would creep up over the years. These are all 18 to 2024, all the years of López Obrador's government. But it would go up by a minuscule amount, arguing that inflation was going to be a problem if they raised it too fast, blah, blah, blah. That has not been the case. That is one of the reasons why we're seeing the poverty levels drop in this country. So, but I also think that, as we understand, when the minimum wage is, it's a bit of a floor, right? As if that rises, then all wages in general rise. And that's been the case. We've seen a very much improvement. The other thing when I would say about being a labor-friendly government, in 2019 on May 1st, there was a very important labor reform that was passed. So the way that I always kind of talk about the labor situation in this country is that following the Mexican Revolution, there was emergence of a corporatist model, which is, so you had trade unions that weren't really that democratic. There obviously always were. There's some very historic examples of that, the teachers, the electricity workers union, the railroad workers union. But a lot of them were kind of, for lack of a better term, kind of like company unions. But the trade-off was the kind of the pact, the social pact was, we'll give you, so you won't really have democratic control over your workers' organizations, but you'll have good wages and you'll have an improved quality of life. And that was true for many, many years until it wasn't, until you had no democratic ability to transform your workers' organizations and you had really bad contracts. In fact, some workers would ask to see the contract and they would refuse to get them. And so the 2019 reform, labor law reform, basically what it does is democratize the trade union movement, making it so that there has to be supervised election. Contracts have to be actually voted upon and agreed upon, et cetera, sort of strengthening the ability of the state to intervene in the cases of, undemocratic actors in the trade union movement, et cetera, et cetera. There's still a long way to go. But the fact that that reform was passed really speaks to the fact that there is an interest in uplifting the conditions for the working class in this country. And then the last one would be also the role of USMCA. So USMCA, NAFTA 2.0, includes a very important provision around labor issues, which, again, in Mexico Solidarity Project, we have a labor committee, and they get into much more detail in terms of that. It sounds really good on paper. In practice, it's been a little bit frustrating that basically they get a slap on the wrist. But then, nonetheless, you have this agreement that the state is very much interested in utilizing as part of its arsenal of tools that it has at its disposal, which protect workers' interests. Okay. Beyond that, Mexico's forced transformation. I always emphasize this as well as a Marxist, is that I think it's important to redistribute wealth. I think that any government that calls itself leftist should make a dedicated effort to do so. So I've talked about the universal social programs. I've talked about the cash transfer programs. But obviously, there's been a bigger role for the state to drive economic development in the country, specifically through a number of instances. So there's the rescue of the state oil company, Pemex. Pemex was suffering under creeping privatization. Basically, the kind of the classic scenario of underfunding it, borrowing too much money, using it as a cash cow, kind of basically leaving it in a condition that made it enticing that argument to say, well, this has to be privatized because if it isn't, it's not going to be productive, and we need private capital to come in, all this kind of stuff. That's what Peña Nieto tried to do during his administration in the last government, and got advanced somewhat, was able to pass a reform. Some oil fields, especially the deep water drilling in the Gulf, were opened up to private investment, private capital, but most of that has been frozen or rolled back under López Obrador. So there's a couple of ones because of contract reasons they have to go forward, but for the most part, oil exploration, extraction, refining, and sale is done by the state, which is something that was being slowly lost and has been rolled back. The state electricity company is now under public control again. So the way that they were creeping privatization efforts there was through the quote unquote greening of energy production, which were really unfair contracts, which basically made it so that people who produce quote unquote green energy through natural gas or through wind farms would have preferential treatment from the National Electricity Commission to basically force them to pay them first and buy the electricity first. And what it did was, one, privatize energy generation in a significant way, but also punish the state. So all of the hydroelectric plants and all of the rest of the kind of the capacity that had already been built over the last few decades was kind of second place to this private one. So that's been rolled back. And in fact, 12 or 13 electricity plants, generation plants, were nationalized. So they were bought from the company that owned them, Iberdrola, and now 52% of energy generation is in public hands, which kind of gives you that advantage of having majority control and also being able to determine where you're actually buying your electricity, which is bringing prices down, particularly in rural communities. So that's just a little bit about the fourth transformation. But I kind of want to get into some of the politics of why somebody like myself strongly sympathizes with what's happening in the country. I have my criticism as well, as of course, as we all should. But there's a couple of things here, and recent experiences over the last 2 years, I think, in Mexico and with what's happening at the election, help us understand what's going on in terms of what is the class character of this government? Why is it something that we should be paying attention to? What are the lessons that that can be drawn? Why I think it's wrong when people go on social media and say, "Oh, López Obrador is not a left government for this or that reason." So I'll go through quickly here. The central role of political mobilization. So mobilizing supporters is a key part of how politics is done in this country. So it's not politics from above exclusively. In fact, there's a lot of mass participation and a lot of mass enthusiasm for what's happening. And I'll get into the details of that. I talked about the central role of class politics. This is a labor-friendly government. There are things that are happening that I think are very significant when it comes to uplifting the conditions and the ability of the working class itself to become motors of a deepening of the process or a radicalization of the process. The central role of political sovereignty. It's something that kind of fell out of fashion for a while. I think, in particular, anybody else who's old enough to remember the anti-globalization struggles, that's kind of where I started to cut my teeth in politics. Remember kind of protesting against this idea that, that sovereignty is a dated notion and that we should just kind of submit ourselves to the end of history kind of argument that in neoliberal capitalism is what rules, and that means that borders and sovereignty doesn't matter as much. And I think that has really changed under this government. In fact, I think one of the key things, as I said at the beginning, is actually sort of taking up that cause again as a banner, una bandera de lucha, a struggle, as a point of struggle for our political work when we're thinking about what does internationalism look like in 2024. And then the last thing, which is what I'm adding to this presentation, because we're in an election, which is the central role of universal rights. Like we are now talking about rights in a way that hadn't happened in a long time, and I think is actually a really welcome development. I mentioned that I'm a master's student in human rights, and human rights belongs to the left, even though it's used as a bludgeon against the left by imperialism, by Brussels, by Washington, by Ottawa. Trying to talk as if they are the people who can decide who is respectful of human rights or not. I think we should take it back, and I think we should take it back in a sense the way that things are actually being proposed here in Mexico. Okay, I feel like I'm going a little bit long, and I know I'm talking really fast, so I apologize. But I do want to talk a little bit about this demos and counter demos, about this mass participation. So I mentioned that the opposition doesn't quite know what to do about the political reality in this country right now. And they think that, slick marketing campaigns or astroturf campaigns, for those of you who are not familiar with that term, I think it's an important term, so I'm going to define it real quick. We understand grassroots efforts to affect social change, mobilizing people, neighbors getting together, communities, whatever you have it. AstroTurf is when you have big money coming in to try to simulate or fake that kind of grassroots mobilization. It's not actually grassroots. It doesn't represent a political base. What it does is represent sort of very specific class interests that are coming from above. And that's very much what's happening in Mexico. One of the things you may have heard about, so if you're not familiar with Mexico, but you may have seen in the news, is a quote unquote authoritarian backslide or authoritarian regression in this country. And the reason you've heard about that is because, one, I think most foreign correspondents are about as, are as clueless as the opposition is in terms of what's happening in this country. They mostly talk to the same people. Like, I think it's extraordinary that the same voices from 20 years ago are still being quoted in stories today about what's happening in the country. I don't think these people are actually capable of understanding what's happening in this country, or they refuse to do the work necessary to actually give you a political analysis that is worth your time. People like Jorge Castañeda, who used to be foreign minister, gets a lot of airway because he speaks English and he lived there a bunch of years. Carlos Bravo Regidor, who also gets all kinds of attention when really, his analysis is poor. It's not useful. Even if I was in opposition, I would not be going to him to tell me to help understand the country. But these are the voices you're hearing from. You had David Frum publishing an article in the Atlantic. We all know who David Frum is. The speechwriter for George W. Bush. I'll get to him at the end of the presentation. Coming and talking about this authoritarian regression happening in this country. And it's because he's talking to the same people who are also informing the opposition strategy, all this kind of stuff. But the reason you've heard it is because these kinds of things echo in US media. But because they've also successfully made this an issue where they're actually able to get people to turn out. So if the opposition holds a demonstration, most people don't turn out. In fact, we're in election period right now. And what we've seen almost at every single one that's happened here in the Capitol is that they'll pay migrants to be there just to kind of fill out the crowd. So they're not very good at mobilizing. The opposition right now is largely led by the National Action Party, the right-wing PAN, P-A-N, and they're actually the smallest of all the political parties in this country. So they don't actually have a lot of militantes or supporters. And so they struggle to get people, but they found an issue that works for them, which is the defense of the National Electoral Institute, the defense of democracy in this country. And at the end of 2022, on November 13th, they actually had a pretty successful demo. You can see in this picture here, that's a big crowd. That's the Monument to the Revolution. It shows that this issue is resonating, but it's informing their strategy. They're like, okay, so we can't get people to come out, but if we keep pretending like we're the ones defending democracy, if we keep fooling foreign correspondents to write about this as if it's an actual problem, it isn't. If we can keep getting these pundits in the English-speaking media to write about it as well, we'll look more legitimate, and it'll actually be really important for what happens come June, which is what we're here to talk about a little bit. I'm going to skip this. Anyway, so in response to the opposition mobilizing, López Obrador also calls for his own demonstration, which I think is always an interesting exercise because, well, the streets belong to us. Who hasn't been on a demo? And when we get to that chant, whose streets are streets? And, while it is actually a sign of how healthy the country's democracy is, the fact that you can go out and hold your opposition demonstrations and criticize the government and present your candidates and all this kind of stuff. I don't think there's actually much of an argument that there's an authoritarian regression in this country. It is important that if they turn out people, that we turn out people. And so in response, 1 million people took to the streets at the end of November in 2022. And I'm not exaggerating, right? So I live and work in Mexico City. I was there. It was extraordinary. So López Obrador says, I want to walk the entire route to the Zócalo to give my speech. And it took him between 4 and 5 hours to make it through the crowd. That's how big it was. He started at the Angel of Independence, walked all the way to the Zócalo, and it was just absolutely, the streets were absolutely packed. So when people talk about there being 1 million, I believe them. But to give you an idea, and this has become an iconic picture, it's actually the cover of López Obrador's latest book, is this image, which I always kind of leaves me, with, it makes my skin, what's it called? Goosebumps. It gives me goosebumps. You can see López Obrador there at the center, kind of the arms outstretched, the sun basking. It's an extraordinary photo, but it gives you an idea. That's what it looked like the entire route down Paseo de la Reforma, which is one of the widest avenues in Latin America, all the way to the Zócalo. So yes, there was 1 million people. And I think it's important to say that we turned out more, right? The Morena was able to turn out more supporters and show that, in fact, the people support the president. And beyond opinion polls, which are also overwhelmingly show that the people support the president, it oscillates anywhere between, it's never dipped below 50, but between 60, 70, he's consistently the second most popular leader in the world. So this, again, just to emphasize that this isn't just a top-down, the government's here to solve all your problems, but really kind of mass participation, mass buy-in, people responding to that call to come out and demonstrate. Okay, so again, to go really quickly, a little bit of this story, the opposition sees this, the government sees this, this mobilization, they feel empowered, but they're still, it's still a bourgeois state, and you still need to negotiate to be able to pass constitutional reforms, and they don't get it. Morena is unable to make a deal with any of the opposition parties because even though they have a majority, they don't have a super majority. They don't have a qualified majority, the 2/3 to make the constitutional amendments. And so they move on to Plan B. The opposition says, no, we also reject Plan B, which would have required just a simple majority in the Congress to approve. The courts ended up rolling it back anyway. But it's important because in this demonstration, the organizers made an effort to appear less partisan, or to appear nonpartisan. And so you had kind of classic actors from the opposition attending the demonstration, making very partisan speeches from the stage. And so it tells us that, like I said, this was an astroturf campaign to begin with. It was an excuse to mobilize their supporters. It's not really one that's motivated by a defense of democracy, but rather actual partisan interests of supporting the opposition, et cetera, et cetera. Again, they hold a very successful rally. They held another one actually very recently in February. Again, they fill the Zócalo. There's a tendency among some supporters of Morena to underplay how many people turn out. I think it's important to be honest. These are how many people turned out. And so he mobilizes supporters again on March 18th. And I always emphasize this one. We're about to come up on the 1-year anniversary of this, but March 18, 2023, it's the anniversary of the expropriation of the oil industry. So again, remember I was talking about mass politics, talking about centered around workers' interests, but also political sovereignty. So March 18th is the day that we celebrate the expropriation of the oil industry, but it's also a day that we remember the importance. What role does political sovereignty, national sovereignty play in a political transformation? 1938 being the year that Lázaro Cárdenas, who was a general in the Mexican Revolution, one who was closest to the working class, closest to the campesinos, kind of really tried to fulfill the promises of the Mexican Revolution. López Obrador always talks about him as a kind of a figure, as a role model. He wants to be remembered the way that Lázaro Cárdenas is remembered. Here's where there's a picture of Cárdenas now, the oil derrick, kind of like the theme was really obvious. So 1 million people didn't come out, but somewhere between 400 and 500,000 people, so 500,000 come out, explicitly under this theme, the defense of national sovereignty, right? So you're having 500,000 people turn out and march alongside the president and chant alongside the president and his political project in defense of national sovereignty. So it talks about the kind of the political level. A lot of people in Mexico here talk about la revolución de las conciencias, or revolution of consciousness. And I think that is very much the case. That is what's happening here in the country. There not only has there been a change in government, but there's been a change in the mindset of the people. And I think I mentioned here at the end, there's a deliberate effort to kind of tie what's happening today to the monumental and popular decisions that previous governments did. Why do I say that? Because of this picture. I love this picture. This is from the Zócalo, from the plancha, from the square, and it says, in defense of national sovereignty. And you see 1938, the expropriation of the oil industry, 1960, López Mateos, nationalization of the electricity industry. And there's López Obrador in the middle, the nationalization of lithium, which happened under 2012. So all lithium reserves in this country are nationalized, and they have to be explored by the state-owned industry called Litio MX. So you can see this idea, I think, is very much a very interesting exercise in what kind of reminds me a bit of Venezuela, right? When Hugo Chavez would take to the podium and give a lecture on Gramsci's political thought. That's what's happening in this country. That's why I go so far as to say it's a revolutionary transformation. This is a quick quote. I'm running long on time, so I'm going to skip it. In all of this, so if we're seeing mass participation, we're seeing victory after victory at the ballot box, what ends up happening is that the old regime retreats. It retreats into its conservative strongholds. It goes into places where it is able to continue to affect public policy or public opinion. So they go to the media, they go to the courts. Right now, one of the key battles happening in this country is what do we do about the very rotten judicial branch of government, which very much is either in cahoots with organized crime or is in cahoots with the old regime. It's a very precarious situation because it's another branch of government. And so it's easy to kind of fall into that trap of being like, well, no, you have to respect the autonomy and all this kind of stuff. But what do you do when it's acting against the popular interests, against the popular will? So that's the battle that's happening right now. It's one of the features of this election. But this is what I mean. So it goes into the media. I talked about these articles about the authoritarian regression, about the imperialism, issuing ultimatums on Mexico over its energy policies, right? I always point out the fact that, so Mexico banned GMO corn, first with human consumption and then in general. And the US obviously exports a lot of GMO corn to Mexico, and so they're very unhappy about it. That's always to be expected. They're going to use these trade tribunals that obviously favor the interests of, of capital over the interests of workers. But the interesting thing is, who joined that petition around GMO corn? Canada. And Canada does not sell corn to Mexico, but it's all part of a club, right? They have to show that they're also opposed to these policies. They claim that, there's no scientific basis for it. I think there is, but even if there wasn't, right? That's what Mexico has decided. The population says we don't want GMO corn, and they're going to try to, use all their instruments at their disposal. So it shows you the logic of imperialism, and not just US imperialism, but Canadian as well, which obviously plays a major role in Latin America in general. No time to get into that now. I think it's important to think about as a journalist. So I live and work as a journalist, to kind of pay attention to the way that consent is being manufactured in terms of either indirect interference by imperialism in Mexico, but also some pretty wild proposals out there that are being floated about direct military intervention in Mexico by the United States, be it an invasion or drone strikes. But anyway, the point is this. So that article that I showed you briefly about the authoritarian regression by these authors here, written at the height of all of this attention being paid to the so-called defense of democracy happening in this country. And they say this, and this is the one that really kind of had the light bulb go off for me. The last thing that AMLO wants to do at the swearing-in ceremony for Mexico's next president is to place the presidential sash over the shoulders of an opposition president-elect, and in doing so, jeopardize the legacy of his so-called fourth transformation and the survival of his pet projects and policies. Now, you read a sentence like that, and you would obviously conclude, if you didn't know anything about the country, that the opposition is well poised to win the next election, and it's going to ruin López Obrador's plan for his legacy and his quote unquote. I always find that anytime you see people talk about pet projects in the global South, it's kind of racist, right? Why is it that, these are historic investments when they happen in a Western European country, but if Mexico built a train, it's a pet project. Anyway, point is that it makes it seem like this is just an ego-driven project and nothing's really changed. This is just López Obrador and his huge ego wanting to cement his place in Mexican history, blah, blah, blah. What they're trying to do is sow this seed that the opposition stands a good chance, that López Obrador is going to do whatever it takes to make sure that he doesn't put a presidential sash over the shoulders of an opposition president-elect, that he's going to do whatever it takes to save his fourth transformation, et cetera, et cetera. It's a very revealing sentence in terms of how does our class adversaries and enemies, how do our class enemies think? And I always say this, like I mentioned, I work a lot with Venezuela. It's kind of, some of the things are repeating themselves. The labeling of a leftist leader as a threat to a country and its democracy is a classic strategy. It's a classic strategy. It's what they did to Chavez. It's what they're doing to Maduro. It's what they do in Nicaragua. It's what they do in Bolivia. Let's remember that Bolivia experienced a military coup d'etat in 2019 that imperialism obviously supported. And it all began with this demonization of Evo Morales as an anti-democrat or as anti-indigenous, the fact being the first indigenous, or like this whole thing around the fires, saying that he wasn't doing enough. I think there's always this effort to manufacture consent. And it's very dangerous because it can lead to what we're seeing in the situation of Venezuela. Now, I will continue fighting until the very last day to defend Venezuela in the Bolivarian process, right? But I do think that if we can stop this from happening before it starts in Mexico, we need to do everything possible to do that, because it gets really complicated to list sanctions. I don't know if people realize this, right? But the sanctions that are happening today, the things that have Venezuela as in the economic situation that it finds itself, all began with Obama's decree in 2015, right? They have to renew that actually every year, the Obama decree, because that's how it begins. And they'll begin by saying, oh no, well, they were this effort at reforming the electoral laws that requires sanctions. And then they start adding and adding and adding and adding. And in Washington, it becomes almost impossible to try to reverse those. Like I mentioned, some of this gets really kind of ridiculous. Hopefully maybe in the discussion we can get into this. But, you have former Trump officials, Mike Pompeo, William Barr, talking in opinion articles and columns about the need to not to declare a war on drug cartels. They say that, but it would be a war in Mexico. You can't attack a sovereign country without its permission, the way that they're proposing, without it being an act of war. And that's the kind of that's where the conversation is. We have Biden talking about illegals in the State of the Union, right? This is how far we've gotten in terms of this discussion. And it's very, very dangerous, because I always mention this whenever this slide comes up, but it's not like drug cartels put banners on top of the buildings where they have their drug labs. So even when they're talking about, oh, we'll just drone strike the drug labs, it will rain destruction on civilian communities, right? Mexican people will suffer directly as a result of these kinds of policies. Those are really real. And the reason it scares me so much, sorry to go on this tangent, but the reason it scares me so much is precisely because this, when it first emerged, if people don't remember, it was Mark Esper's memoirs about his time as Secretary of Defense. And it was when he published the fact that Trump was like, well, why don't we just bomb them? We'll just bomb the drug labs. And Esper thought it was such a ridiculous idea that he wasn't sure if Trump was joking or not. And in fact, if you read the articles at the time, they all treated it like it was a ridiculous idea. And here we are today. It is a mainstream idea in the Republican Party. It is a mainstream idea. Trump's think tank has now developed explicit plans about how to carry out a drone strike without Mexico's authorization inside of Mexico. That's the point. And if it can go from fringe to mainstream that quickly, I think it can go from proposal to reality just as quickly. And that's the part that scares me. Okay. I'm very, very low on time. And here I promise I'll give you 10 more minutes and then we'll wrap up. But I think this around the thought of the threats of invasion, right? This is from Jeet Heer's What's Behind the New Calls to Invade Mexico and the Nation from last year. According to David Frum, writing in The Atlantic, liberal democracy in Mexico is under assault, given Frum's famous contribution as George W. Bush's speechwriter to the use of pro-democracy rhetoric to justify invading other countries. His intervention is suspect. At the very least, Frum's thinking suggests the worrying possibility of an alliance of uber-reactionaries like Marjorie Taylor Greene and the more polished establishment voices of the foreign policy elite in a shared project of regime change in Mexico. I think this was written in April 4th, 2023, and I think that's more true now than it was before. I think that the objective, despite the platitudes that are often exchanged, for most people in Washington is for regime change in Mexico. Now, the Democrats would like it to happen via the ballot box. The Republicans are willing to do it through invasion, but the end goal is the same. It's regime change. And I think that's something to keep in mind. And I think it's important to remember when you hear people say, oh, Mexico's not a leftist government. If it's not a leftist government, why does Washington want to oust Morena from power? I like to show this video because I think it speaks to all of those points that I made previously around what is this project about? Mass participation, mass rallies, the working class coming out, the masses supporting this project, the defense of sovereignty, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So in the face of this kind of this language of thoughts of invasion about this political project, I think it's quite telling to see this captures the feeling on the ground. This is what I think the opposition and the pundits just aren't seeing, or if they do see it, they don't understand it. So I'm just going to play this video real quick.
Recordamos a esos políticos hipócritas e irresponsables que México es un país independiente y libre, no una colonia ni un protectorado de Estados Unidos. Y que podrán amenazarnos con cometer cualquier atropello, pero jamás permitiremos que violen nuestra soberanía y pisoteen la dignidad de nuestra patria. Cooperación, sí. Sometimiento, no. Intervencionismo, no. Oligarquía, corrupción, clasismo, racismo, libertad, democracia, honestidad, justicia social, igualdad, soberanía, viva la expropiación petrolera.
So you can see, I mean, I'm always struck by that video. I've probably seen it like 100 times, right? But explicitly saying no to subjugation. They will not violate our sovereignty. Long live the expropriation, right? Et cetera, et cetera. The use of the word liberty and democracy, kind of retaking those terms that have been co-opted by our adversaries in a way, in a mass audience, in a mass form. Remember, this is March 18th. This is the day that we're celebrating the expropriation of the oil industry. This is 500,000 people in the public square and the adjoining streets. So Mexico's future, and this is where I'll close. Again, to quoting that article from Jeet here, it is AMLO's political success, rather than his troubles controlling the drug cartels, that is surely the main cause of the new calls for attacking Mexico. If the United States does invade Mexico in the coming years, it will doubtless do so on the pretext of defending democracy and trying to defeat the drug cartels. But behind this rhetoric lies the desire of a weakened superpower to reassert its hegemony and retain control of resource extraction. That's what's happening. That is the ultimate analysis. Again, Biden can say all he wants that he's friends with López Obrador, and López Obrador can say all he wants, or that he's friends with Trump and he's friends with Biden. But there are class interests here. There is an interest of the US ruling class wanting to use the ability it has or the influence it has over the US government to make sure that US hegemony is the one that reigns, and that it's able to continue to treat Mexico as a place where it's cheap resources and cheap labor. And the project of Morena changes that. And that's why you see these antagonisms. If you're able to see the class dynamics of it, then I think it becomes very clear. So we're in an election year. I'm not going to show this video. It's just it's a good example of just how clueless the opposition is, how clueless the correspondents here in this country are. I think the opposition, which is in a forced marriage, so this business magnate, Claudia X Gonzalez, they would call him an oligarch if he was in Russia, has forced the opposition to become in one coalition together, the PRI, the PAN, and the PRD. One thing to keep in mind is these parties don't actually like each other. They've been convinced by this argument that only together do they stand a chance, but they don't actually like helping each other get elected because they've been historic rivals. And that they don't really have anything to offer. They're actually promising that they're going to keep the social programs in place. Xochitl Gálvez, who's the candidate of the opposition, she's a senator from the right-wing PAN. She literally cut her finger and signed a pledge with blood saying that she was not going to cut social programs because, one, people don't believe them, but two, that's how popular they are. So they're not really offering anything to the population, but they think that a woman who is of indigenous descent, her father's Otomi, her mother's Mestiza, is going to be enough to convince people to go back to the opposition. Again, just a total lack of analysis. So why do I say that? And then this is why I always like to end on this point. These are the polling numbers. So these are from December, but they haven't really changed. Claudia Sheinbaum, so the candidate that's been selected by Morena to run on behalf of the party and its allies, the PT and the Green Party, used to be mayor of Mexico City, very much kind of represents the left of center flank inside of the party. Her nearest rival was Marcelo Ebrard, the former foreign minister, or foreign secretary, and he very much kind of represented a pivot to the center. I think that could be very dangerous. I always mention Ecuador when I talk about this. Sometimes when parties feel nervous that they're losing some of the support that they once had earlier on, they pivot to the center. In Ecuador, they did that with Lenin Moreno, and it cost them dearly with the treason that he committed. Not that I think Ebrard would have been treasonous, but it definitely would have represented kind of a shift to the center, whereas Claudia Sheinbaum very much kind of represents continuity, and if anything, a shift to the left. So she's polling at 65 to 13%. All right. Or if you distribute eliminating the people who don't know how they're going to vote yet, 61.4 to 30.9. At best, Xochitl Gálvez gets like 30, 32%. She's never really polled above that. She's nowhere even close to Claudia Sheinbaum. She pretty much has it in the bag. It's almost impossible to come back from that kind of deficit. It's very, very, very likely, unless something extraordinary happens, Claudia Sheinbaum is going to win on June 2nd. And in fact, Morena is not really playing to just win the election, but they talk about, remember I've talked about the electoral changes, the reforms, plan A, plan B. They talk about plan C. Plan C is to win a supermajority in these elections in the Congress so that they don't have to negotiate with the opposition, so they can roll back all those neoliberal reforms, so they can make all of these changes, so they can clean up the judiciary. Is it going to happen? I don't know. It's going to be close. It's very hard to win a supermajority, 2/3 majority. But that's the aim, right? But that sets up a very dangerous scenario. What that ends up doing is, so because the opposition doesn't really stand a chance, what have they been doing? They've been going around trying to discredit the election, to undermine confidence in the results. So when I talked about earlier about the danger of this pro-democracy authoritarian backslide rhetoric, about the way that the punditry covers this country, about the way the forced correspondents are reporting about this country, that's the danger. Because again, to remember what happened in Bolivia or what happened with Hugo Chavez, every time the opposition loses, they cry fraud. And it's going to be tough for them to pull it off in this one because the gap is going to be so big. Like, even if there was fraud, you don't steal 30% of the votes. But that's kind of what they're going for. And I think there's going to be a deliberate effort, if not to question the results in order to try to destabilize the government and prevent them from actually being able to exert authority, or they're going to try to undermine her mandate so that Claudia Sheinbaum doesn't have a strong position to govern. And in a very complex country like Mexico, with all its internal dynamics, but also the external issue with the US, it's going to be very, very complicated. But here's the thing, and this is my final slide. You can see these are pictures I took from the opening rally on March 1st, so a few days ago, in the Zócalo. Once again, all totally packed, totally full. The adjoining streets, totally full. They calculate between 350 to 400,000 people coming out. So just rivers and rivers of people. Again, that mass politics. And the difference, and the thing that I would add, so everything I said about López Obrador is true of Claudia Sheinbaum. I think in a lot of ways she is a very good heir to his legacy, in the sense that she's seen as very loyal to López Obrador. Even some of her style is the same, right? She speaks a little bit slowly than she used to do in order to kind of communicate with as broad an audience as possible. Like, López Obrador speaks slowly like that for a reason. That's what she's trying to do. López Obrador did his first rally in 2018, promising 100 things. Claudia Sheinbaum promised 100 things. But the thing that I would underline about her that I think is the more interesting thing, which is that last point that I made at the very beginning, which is that kind of the central role of a rights-based discourse. So if you look at some of their advertising that they're putting out right now, they criticize the opposition for being against social programs historically and all this kind of stuff. But there's one line that they make in one of the ones that I really liked, which was, this isn't about giving people opportunities. This is about making sure that their rights are respected. And that's what's happening. It's like there's a series of promises that Mexico has made to its population that it hasn't kept. And now it's actually trying to, under that understanding that we're not doing you a favor. These aren't, this isn't manna from above. These are your rights. You are entitled to healthcare. You are entitled to education. You are entitled to safety, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All of these things in a rights-based discourse. So That's why we exist. I'm going to skip all this. Mexico Solidarity Project. So we have the Mexico Solidarity Bulletin. We have the Mexico Solidarity Media website. I did a couple of speaking tours. We might do a documentary, so I might try to come and visit the United States again. Kurt Hackbarth, Kurt writes for Jacobin. You've probably seen his writing if you follow Mexico. He and we started a new podcast, part of the Mexico Solidarity Project umbrella, called Soberanía, that concept, sovereignty, the Mexican Politics Podcast, where he and it's a bi-weekly at this point. We might increase it to weekly soon, to basically just talk about everything that's wrong. Like we had these awful articles in the Texas Observer. We had this other one, ProPublica, New York Times. We kind of break down all of the terrible coverage of this country. So to kind of help explain the country to those of you who, maybe don't have the opportunity to follow it so closely, and kind of keep people up to speed about what's happening, especially because it's an election year. So it's going to be really important for people to pay attention because of all the things that I just described, because this danger of undermining Claudia Sheinbaum's mandate. And I think that's going to require what I call sort of the national sovereignty dialectic, which is the role of people who identify as internationalists defending Mexican sovereignty from within the belly of the beast. Precisely the people in this room, the people who are here with us today, defending Mexican sovereignty, however you imagine that looks like, right? Be it through talks, getting better informed, talking to your neighbors, reading our website, sharing our materials, going to Washington, talking to your representatives. The attacks are coming. We know that there's going to be this effort to try to undermine Claudia because she could very much represent a deepening, a radicalization of this project. She always talked about building the second floor of this project. And so it's indispensable. I think have faith that, as you can see in these images that I've shared with you, that the population in Mexico is ready to defend its sovereignty and its political sovereignty. But I think that for us to be successful in actually being able to stop imperialism, it requires intervention by yourselves. I think that's what anti-imperialism in the 21st century looks like. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. Excellent presentation, and also hearing good news on the international arena. When we hear so much bad news, we're looking forward to, it's guaranteed that there will be a woman president, the first woman president in Venezuela, in Mexico, and we'll hope that that woman will also be the first Jewish president and the first president, actually maybe in the world, to have won a Nobel Prize in science. So before we go into the Q&A, I'd like to tell you something about the programs that are coming up. We have some really great programs. Alan, would you be able to tell us a little bit about Tony Platt? Alan Miller, if you're not there, I don't see Alan Miller responding, so I'll tell you about Tony Platt. Next week, Tony Platt will be speaking on Cal Berkeley, People's Park and Law and Order. He's spoken before at the library. He's a criminology expert, former University of California and Sacramento State professor in criminology. And he's going to talk about the sort of sordid background of the University of California going forward into the current stuff around People's Park. You shouldn't miss that program next week. The following week, we're going to have another speaker, and Raj, maybe you can tell us a little bit about that speaker. Unmute yourself, please. And Raj, unmute yourself, please.
Sorry about that. So that is Basudev Nag Chaudhary. He leads a new communist party based in West Bengal. Kolkata is the big city in West Bengal. He's also a writer of a book, Neoliberalism, the irresolvable stage of global capitalism. And so it's kind of related to what today's topic was, but it goes further. So I think it's going to be very, very important. He's also very involved in mobilizing of workers in Kolkata. So that's the program. I think it'll be very exciting.
Thank you, Raj. And then the following week, April 7th, Ann Garrison will be speaking. She's a columnist for the Pacifica Radio, KPFA. She has a program on Africa as well, and she writes for the Black Agenda Report on Africa. And she will be telling us about the Rwandan genocide. Again, will be a very important program. So please join us then. Check our website, icssmarks.org, for other updates and to also see the videos of these programs. This program will be posted as a video on that website in another few days. So we'll go into the Q&A. Our usual procedure for Q&A is that raise your hand by going to the reactions, and I'll call people more or less in the order that they raise their hands. You have about 2 minutes to either make a question or make a comment, and do both. And then Jose Luis will have the opportunity to respond at his leisure. So Michael, you're up next, followed by Richard. Please unmute yourself, Michael.
Yeah, you said that AMLO was the second most popular leader in the world. Do you know who the most popular is? Who AMLO's second to?
It's actually Modi in India. So I usually leave that out because it's not good company.
Okay, Richard and then Jean.
Okay. Thank you for a nice presentation. I was part of the Mexican Solidarity Project for a while. I'm not sure what happened, but in any case, I've got a couple of questions here that occurred to me. I'll take them in sort of semi-reverse order, and sort of ease of response, if you will. One thing that I thought about is there's a comparison to AMLO to Bernie Sanders here. And I really do believe that the left in this country needs to look for a new version of Bernie Sanders. Could you maybe talk to on that a little bit? The second question I had is, as a journalist, and this is maybe a little bit off topic, there's a lot of new forms of communications that are springing up that seem to be in part replacing the old mainstream media. Maybe if you could comment a little bit of that. And this one is a little bit more in depth and maybe touching on some raw nerves. You mentioned that Mexico had its revolution preceding the Russian Revolution. And yet there's a big debate going on between Russia and China over which one is more capitalist, which one is more socialist. Never is it brought up about the Mexican side of things. If Mexico is capitalist, if Mexico is socialist. Could you maybe address why that? Do you have any opinion on why that's the case? Or I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Okay, sure. On the first thing you mentioned, please come back. We need volunteers. Join the Mexico Solidarity Project. There's so many different ways to get involved these days too, as well. So I really, really encourage everybody to get involved. MexicoSolidarity.com or MexicoSolidarityProject.org. Either one will take you to where we have our information. At the very least, hopefully everybody in this meeting will sign up to the bulletin. If you could maybe share that in the chat later, I'll put a link in there as well, because we need more people. And the bulletin is probably the easiest way to kind of begin your involvement, because you can just get a message once a week, every Wednesday. I really like one of the founders of the project said, it's like a friend coming over for coffee. Hey, let's talk about Mexico for about an hour. If you treat it like that, then you open up your email and give it a read. I think it's a fun exercise. So sign up for the bulletin. Also available in Spanish in case Spanish is more comfortable for you, or anybody else who's listening. Please check us out, but that's probably the first way to get involved. So the comparison of AMLO to Bernie, I think, is pretty natural. I think it kind of makes sense. Older figures, people who've been very prominent on a sort of non-establishment, we could say, kind of positioning, posturing. But to kind of relate it to the way that you frame that question, my answer would be this. I think López Obrador was probably the only figure who was capable of dislodging the old regime from the state power the way that he did, through democratic means, by winning that landslide election, by having the political skills to navigate governing a country that like Mexico, and also navigating the threats coming from, be it from the opposition or the oligarchs or US capital or US imperialism, navigating a very unpredictable president in Donald Trump, navigating a very dishonest president in Biden, et cetera, et cetera. So I think beyond everything I talked about in the presentation, one of the key things that I would talk about when it comes to López Obrador is that all of us who dream of a more socialist Mexico owe him a debt for being able to displace the old regime. Because without that, I don't think that we would be able to be in a better position. For example, I don't really subscribe to the accelerationist logic, right? If things get bad enough, people will rise up through an insurrection and armed struggle and all those kinds of things. I think the scenario today, this was the most prudent course of action for those of us who dream of a socialist Mexico, and being able to, navigate, have more room to operate in terms of the governance of this country in a way that I don't think would have been possible under the old regime. And I think opens up a lot of possibilities for a continuing deepening of the transformation of this country. In terms of the second question around media, I would say that the recent incident with the New York Times here in Mexico, and if you didn't see it, basically what happened is, one of the strategies of the opposition is to try to sow this notion that Morena is tied to organized crime. Now, organized crime is active in politics in this country. Of course it is. It's one of the means that they're able to secure the necessary support from within the state, particularly at the municipal level and the state level, less so federally. But this idea of trying to say that Morena is, so López Obrador's party or Claudia Sheinbaum's party, is an extension of organized crime, or it's the political arm of organized crime, is very ludicrous. Why? Because that actually is true of the PAN, of the National Action Party. In fact, the key security chief, so the Secretary for Public Security, Genaro Garcia Luna, was found guilty in a US court of drug trafficking. And he was Felipe Calderón's right-hand man in every sense of the word, not just when it came to security, but he was very, very close ally. Now, he says that he didn't know, but I think it's impossible. He knew. And, one of the spokespeople for Xochitl Gálvez's campaign is Cabeza de Vaca, who is hiding in Texas from Mexican prosecution because of his ties to organized crime. So this notion is pretty ridiculous to us, but this is what they're going with. And they've sowed this idea. The Baker Institute published this in their Mexico annual report, and then Texas Observer did an interview with Tony Payan, where he was able to launder his ideas via that author, Lise Olson. Then there was a piece in ProPublica that was published at the same time as another one as Insight Crime and Deutsche Welle, that again alleged that in 2016, organized crime gave $2 million to López Obrador campaign, not to him, but his campaign, on the promise that he would basically let them have free reign over the country, which is pretty, I don't want to get into it, but come on, like $2 million is chump change to these groups, right? They operate in the billions. You think that the president is gonna, the candidate was gonna sacrifice his policy for $2 million, even if it was true? I don't know. The whole thing reeks of a bit of a reach, to say the least. And then finally, the New York Times runs a piece about 3 weeks ago at this point, maybe less, maybe 2, not alleging that 2016, but 2018, there was illegal, illicit financing by organized crime groups to the López Obrador campaign. Now, here's the thing. If that were true, I would be willing to critically engage with it, right? Like if you could be like, okay, they've really made a convincing case in this article, but it was all based on US reports, which is to say interested parties, and leaks from what is most likely, as Marcelo Ebrard says, coming from the DEA. The DEA hates López Obrador because he limited their ability to operate freely the way that they used to in this country. So they're not allowed to carry arms. They're not allowed to operate independently. He grounded their plane. They have to submit reports in terms of what are the actual cooperation that they're doing with Mexican authorities. That's why you hear the president say things like cooperation, yes, subjugation, no. So the DEA is very much, or at least elements within the DEA, are behind some of these stories. There is no journalistic merit to that story that was published by the New York Times. And I say that as a journalist. I can't believe it made it past an editor. If it made it past an editor, I think we should actually look at the recent controversy that they've been going through at that paper over the coverage of Palestine and the genocide there. There is an editorial interest in advancing a certain agenda. And that's what the New York Times was trying to do in Mexico, was advance the interests of the forces that are opposed to Morena and López Obrador and Claudia Sheinbaum. So what do we say about all that? What does that mean in terms of your question? Is that people are losing faith. Most people in Mexico are not getting informed, at least the political, hold on, let me restart. The political base of Morena, so not just the rank and file of the party, but the people who sympathize and consistently vote for them. They don't use mainstream media outlets to inform themselves anymore. They use alternative outlets. There are very, very popular YouTube programs. The president himself is one of the most popular Spanish-speaking YouTubers on the planet because of his morning press conference. It's every day during the week, Monday to Friday, about 2 hours, sometimes 3, of him addressing, so usually there's like a presentation at the beginning, some kind of policy proposal or an update on the security situation, whatever. There's lots, and then he takes questions for a while from the press, and reporters are free to go. Yeah, you just have to get access, but it's not like it's hard. And people get informed about that, about the country, about what's happening directly from the president. And so the power that these kind of legacy media outlets used to have is very much diminished in the world, but particularly so in Mexico. And I think that's actually a bit of an advantage. People are interested in finding information elsewhere and are developing the criteria to say, I don't trust that. Something about that doesn't smell right. I'm going to go try to find some more information. And I think that's really important when we're talking about what's happening here in the country.
Okay, thank you. Then the next person up is Jean, followed by Ann Lewis. So Jean Rule, unmute yourself and
Yes, I'm unmuted, I think. Well, Jose, thanks so much. That's a great talk. Really enjoyed it. I learned a lot from it and realized how ignorant I really am about Mexico. And this is really wonderful. I just want to note, before I retired, I taught at Cal State Long Beach. And I remember the most militant and politically aware student group were always the La Raza students. And I remember at one of their demonstrations, or many of their demonstrations, they used to say, we didn't cross the border crossed us. And I think that's kind of true of all of us in the Southwest here from California to Texas. The border crossed us in a sense here. And, when listening to your talk and everything that's happening in Mexico, I feel so envious. Look what's going on. And the government is actually working for the people. I don't know whether you gave the approval rate of the people in terms of the degree to which they approve their government. But, what Biden is down, like our government is like 37% approval rate. Nobody approves either of Biden or Trump. So, we're in a real mess, and I really appreciate that. And again, I'm envious in many respects of what's happening there. But also your warning note at the end about using drones to attack the drug problem in Mexico, violation of their sovereignty. And I think this is a real threat, and I'm in Vets for Peace, which is dedicated to the abolishment of war. And, I think we need to be aware of that. But again, any comments you care to make? I really appreciate your talk. Thank you so much.
I'm so glad you enjoyed it. That's great. That's great feedback. And I'm glad that that's your takeaway, because that's one of the things I would say on the speaking tour. So I went to the East Coast, and then I just finished a West Coast one. Is that I think there's a reason why people don't know much about Mexico, because if they did, they would come away feeling the way that you do. They would say that, like, hey, if they can do it in Mexico, why can't we do it here? And I get it, right? Like, so I lived many years in the United States. So I'm somewhat familiar with politics there, and it's a particularly complicated case, especially with the Electoral College and all this kind of stuff. But let's focus, for example, on the duopoly, right? The fact that there's really only two major parties in the United States, and that's a pretty daunting thing. How do you get a third party candidate on the ballot in all 50 states and kind of operate with such a toxic media environment that writes off any kind of challenge outside of the duopoly, et cetera, et cetera. So I get it. It's tough, and I don't want to minimize the challenge, but I do want to remind people that if you told us in Mexico 10 years ago when Morena was founded that it would have won the way that it did in 2018, that it would consistently win the gubernatorial elections, and that it was polling above 60% in the 2024 election, nobody would have believed you. They would have been like, really, this new party, you really think you're going to? And yet here we are. And on top of that, I would say that in a lot of ways, the system that kind of established itself after the so-called democratization in the year 2000 was a very similar type of duopoly. You have the pre and the center-ish, somewhat trying to cling on to its left legacy. And then you had the pan on the right and the center right. And you kind of just trade back and forth and not a lot of difference. What does that remind us? Democrats and Republicans, right? But on top of that, we also had an extraordinary amount of political violence here, right? In 1988, they assassinated presidential candidates. They were willing to commit fraud in that same election year. They committed fraud in 88. They committed fraud in 2006. Sort of just naked fraud of like ballot box stuffing. And if they were willing to go to those lengths, and we still won in 2018, right? Like there was fraud in 2018, but the election, the advantage that López Obrador had over Israel was so big that even the most finely tuned, well-oiled fraud machine wasn't going to be able to stop his victory. It shows you that if it's possible here under those circumstances, which are arguably more difficult, then you can do it in the United States. Right? Maybe in 10 years, you'll have that same feeling. I remember 10 years ago, somebody said, we're going to get rid of the Democrat-Republican duopoly and finally oust these monsters from Washington. And people would laugh at you, but maybe it is possible. That's the kind of message I always try to give people directly, that it was just as daunting here and it seemed just as insurmountable, and nonetheless, it happened. And I think the fact that you're not hearing about it and you don't know about it is very strategic, because you might get the wrong idea and might actually want to try to do that inside of the United States. And I hope you do, because it would be a blessing to the world.
Well, thank you. And Louis,
another world is possible. Thank you.
I almost don't feel like saying anything, but first of all, I am a longtime member of the Mexico Solidarity Project, so it's so wonderful to see you here. I think we need to get you to Texas, where I live, really badly. Next tour, maybe. I had, first of all, I posted information about the Mexico Solidarity Project in the chat so that you wouldn't have to, and about the bulletin. I feel just as ignorant as everybody else about Mexico. This is the only source that I really have, and I also want to really urge people to read the bulletin, because it's a gentle read. It's not like trying to plunge into Monthly Review or something. It's very real and appropriate, and it gives you links if you want to know more, but it doesn't consume your day in the same way. But it's also very authentic and very honest, and there's arts and there's interviews, and it's really a great read. And largely to do with Meju and some other folks over there. So please, the one question I had, and this is the one that's hard, is what is Morena's? We're all full of the U.S.-Mexico border here, and I know that the problems there are caused by U.S. imperialism and lack of understanding of Mexican sovereignty and all kinds of stuff. But we have a current situation with Central American refugees and African refugees as well, just smashed up against that border. And I'm just wondering, is there any talk in Morena about how to deal with this? I know it's very difficult.
Yeah. So I would always begin precisely with what you just finished mentioning. I think whenever we talk about migration, the conversation has to begin with an acknowledgement that this situation exists as a result of the U.S. not meeting its international obligations to migrants. They have a responsibility to them that is not actually being completed. And so that's, for example, this whole emergence of this phenomenon of applying for asylum. There are obviously many people who are very much fleeing political, religious, sexual orientation, persecution. And that's what, asylum is for those populations. And a lot of people are also applying for asylum as a result of, they're fleeing violence and poverty. Now, if we're looking at things in terms of like the international law, technically, asylum doesn't cover that kind of persecution. But the reason that people use this is because it was one of the only ways of actually being able to pursue human mobility into the United States. And so amongst communities, they figured out that one of the ways that you can actually get inside the United States, if you don't come from a middle-class background and you can't get a visa and all this kind of stuff, is by asking for asylum. And that in and of itself is a symptom of the fact that historically, the US has made it harder and harder and harder to migrate, be it temporarily or permanently, legally. And so that's really where the problem begins and ends. Now, in terms of what's happening inside of Mexico, and I'm glad because it usually comes up, and I think it's important because even though I talk very positively about Morena, for example, I'm not a party member. I wouldn't be because I'm a journalist. I don't think that would be my place to do so, but also because I'm critical, because there are things that I think they have done incorrectly. And I think the way that migrants have been treated by state officials in this country, in Mexico, is unforgivable, straight up, right? I think there are specific reasons why Mexico has pursued the migration policy that it has. So when López Obrador was first elected and first comes into office, he actually does change into a much more humanitarian type of model. And they start issuing humanitarian visas to anybody who asks for it. And what ended up happening, and now I'm not saying that this justifies it, but what ended up happening is that the US came to complain at a high level to Mexico about the fact that they were finding that everybody who was coming to the border, the US-Mexico border, was doing so on humanitarian visas. And so the humanitarian visas meant for you to stay in Mexico, but they were using it to transit in the country. And so they're like, we need you to crack down on this. And the argument was, if you don't, we're going to impose these tariffs that are going to destroy your economy. And so Mexico acquiesced and said, okay, fine, don't impose these tariffs and we'll do some of your dirty work and we'll make it harder for migrants to move through the country. And so in exchange, basically they had a deal that the US would interfere with some of their domestic priorities inside of the country, like around oil, around natural resources, et cetera, et cetera. And okay, so that's the reality of it. I get a little bit frustrated when people are like, well, if Mexico just refused to play their game, then the US would have no choice. That's not true, right? That's not how it would play out. And you're actually asking the geopolitically weaker state to stand up to the bully. And I don't think that's going to go well for us, right? Even though it would be the right thing to do, it would destroy the Mexican economy if they really did impose those tariffs, for example. So that's what is happening now. All that to say is that we could definitely be treating migrants far better. The worst part of the journey is through Mexico. Any migrant will tell you that, right? Not even the Darien, where people die, do people say is as bad as going through Mexico, because they get extorted, because they get robbed. And then the security officials that are in cahoots with the organized crime groups allow for them to be kidnapped or extorted or whatever, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That kind of thing can change. There was that migrant fire in Ciudad Juarez where 43 people died, right? And yet the guy who's in charge of the Migration Institute, who's been charged as a result by the prosecutor's office here in Mexico is still in his post. That's not defendable. Like, there's no way you can actually defend that. That's wrong. And the trouble is that, and you asked me, is there discussion inside of the party? I think there are migrants' rights activists who are very much pushing for this, but it's not high. It's not high on the agenda. There were some forums where the party was trying to develop its platform where this was raised. And very similarly, the rank and file of the party is like, we obviously can be doing a better job, but it's not like a major issue here inside of the party. And so what does that mean? The thing I always say is that I think one of the things that when we talk about kind of real ways that we can practice internationalism is like, how can we better facilitate connections between migrants' rights activists and organizers in the US and in Mexico? Because in the border region, they're really well linked, but they're not in terms of like Mexico City, Washington, right? That kind of strategic public policy level kind of coordination doesn't happen, which I was quite surprised at. I've done a lot of work around migration issues as a migrant myself, but it's just kind of one of those things. Like my work ended up doing, because it was such a hot issue, I ended up getting a lot of articles commissioned to write about this kind of thing. So it's something that I followed closely throughout the López Obrador government. Things have largely stayed the same since they kind of acquiesced to the US's demands. But one of the things that I thought would develop and hasn't is that. And then very recently, there was maybe like 3 months ago, there was a press conference basically sounding the alarm bells over the situation of migrants here in Mexico City. I live very close to the northern bus terminal. So it ends up being a really key point of transit for many migrants. And so I talk to them almost every day. There's something about my face that people always ask me for directions. So I always kind of end up talking to them. Yeah. And so I'm well tuned to it. But again, I'm surprised by the fact that there isn't that coordination. When at that press conference, I was like, hey, like, are you talking with, the people who make proposals around migration in Washington? And there isn't, right? There's just a total disconnect between activists in Mexico and all this kind of stuff. Because ultimately, and I'm not trying to wash Mexico's responsibility, because I want to insist on this. I want to be really clear about this. We can and should be treating migrants much, much better. But ultimately, the solution isn't that. The solution is getting the US to change its policy, and we're moving in the wrong direction. Right? Things are getting much worse. Somebody in the chat said something that was like, an echo of Hitler. And it's true. Like, how is it possible? The State of the Union, probably the biggest stage for the US president in any given year, outside of elections, is talking about illegals killing people? Like, where is the rhetoric at? How did we get there? And how do we coordinate a strategy to start to shift that conversation in the other way? Because it's extraordinary, because things are getting worse. And that's going to make things worse for us. And then the problems are just going to keep piling up. But one, and I'm sorry I went long on this one, but I'm glad the question was asked, is that how many of you know that whenever López Obrador talks about migration, every single time he asks for sanctions to be lifted and for the blockade to end on Cuba and Venezuela? And like, I think that part is underreported deliberately, because ultimately, right, like, who are the migrants that are coming? They're mostly Venezuelan, they're mostly Cuban, and they're mostly Haitian. And what are those? Those are the countries that have most been battered by imperialism. So the fact that the president of the country that is sharing a border with the United States is signaling it needs to be talked about more. Like, it's never mentioned in press coverage, or even this recent conversation that was happening around sealing the border, shutting down the border, right? Basically the Democrats gave to everything the Democrats or the Republicans wanted on shutting down the border, about if this X or Y thing happens, then we'll stop allowing people, be it through official ports of entry or not, blah, blah, blah. And nobody, except for one guy who's actually Mexican, but is based in Washington, bothered to ask, what would Mexico do? Like, if you can't just unilaterally shut down the border like that, like, Mexico does not have an obligation to accept anybody that's being returned from the United States unless there's an agreement in place. And they're all operating under this assumption that you can just throw them back on the other side of the border. That's not true, but it shows you just how far removed from the reality on the ground, right? Like, if you're serious about this proposal, even though it's an awful proposal, how is that not part of the conversation? What are our partners in Mexico going to say? Because if we don't say yes, you don't get to do that, because that's not how borders work. But anyway, it just shows you just how detached from reality much of this discussion is. And I'm hopeful that we can shift it because, like I said, things seem to be getting worse.
Thank you. Raj Sahai, followed by Janet Coburn.
Okay, thank you once again. Thank you very much for a very informative presentation, at least for me. I know very little about Mexico, I'm ashamed to say, for having lived in the United States so long. But what your presentation told me is an incredible achievement of the left in Mexico, even though Morena is a capitalist party. In other words, they are for reform and sovereignty, but they are not for, but they have programs in which they distribute the wealth a little more fairly and poverty reduction. So these are great achievements. And I'm surprised the United States has not already moved in to undermine it, because they call it populist, and then there's this drug thing you're talking about. Now, I noticed that Mexico's 83% of their exports are to the United States, very little to China, 2%. This may be a little older statistic. It may not be true today, but that's what I could find. So one of the leverage United States is that it's a big market on Mexico. So aside from trying to use the and the United States does not tolerate independence. That's around the world. You have to be. They have the mindset of a total imperialist. So my question is, given that kind of dependence, is it changing? Are they diversifying? It's difficult to export to any other country because of the distances. And so this economic relationship, of course, the United States is also, because the United States imports 43% of the export of Mexico go to the United States, and about 20% are now going to China, I believe. Sorry, import from USA is 44%, and from China now approximately 20%. So this is the other reason why it is very difficult to be so close. As the famous thing was,
2 minutes.
Yeah, okay. So just ending. So the old thing was, poor Mexico, how far away from heaven, how close to the United States. So what is changing here, and how is this vulnerability? Is it decreasing or not? If you can focus on that a little bit. Thank you very much.
Sure.
And Jose Luis, if you could also try to
I'll keep it shorter.
Your time, because we'll be getting a little bit to our limit.
Okay, you got it. You got it. Speak. I thought you were going to throw the other quote at me, which is that whenever the United States sneezes, Mexico gets a cold. Right? Like the truth is that especially after 1994 with NAFTA, the economies are deeply integrated, and I don't think there is a viable path out of that deep integration at this point, which is also why you see even progressive parties and leaders like López Obrador and Morena, kind of operating under the assumption that this relationship is going to pretty much, the economic relationship is going to continue as is. Because it's just so deeply connected these days, right? Like entire manufacturing chains are integrated at this point. So it's a disadvantage, of course, because it makes you vulnerable, makes you dependent, but it's an advantage as well because at the end of the day, they need us as much as we need them. And so one of the things there was a recent incident where there was a Twitter account that tweeted, Mexico is interested in joining BRICS. And actually, the Secretary of Foreign Affairs had to release a statement saying, "No, we're not pursuing an entry into BRICS. We view it with interest, and we view it positively for developments, but we're not trying to join BRICS." And in fact, the president has said, "No, our plan is to stick with the North American relationship." because it's true, it is a really big market and it is very favorable. And Mexico operates a trade surplus with the United States, which is good for the country. But the other thing I would say is that, yes, there is a new kind of a reorientation towards a diversification. So there's a big push for nearshoring and all this kind of stuff, and that's happening, and it's going to happen. One of the things that Claudia has talked about on the campaign trail is like, we want foreign direct investment here in Mexico, but you're not going to, this is not Mexico of the 90s where you're just going to get a bunch of like maquiladoras and a bunch of cheap labor and no labor protections and all this kind of stuff, right? Like if you're going to come in here, you're welcome, but you have to respect Mexican laws, which demand the following. There's been CELAC, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States. It kind of was pushed into irrelevance as a result of right-wingers in the region trying to kill it, that in UNASUR. And it was rescued by López Obrador, by Mexico, and then passed on to Argentina, and then passed on to, followed by St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and then following that, it's going to be Honduras and then Colombia. So progressive governments trying to make a more prominent role so that it becomes a stronger bloc that promotes more economic integration. There's the development of the Trans-Isthmic corridor, which is controversial for different reasons, but what it is it's kind of a bet on exporting more towards the Pacific side. So moving more things to the markets that exist in Eastern Asia. But also moving more things through Mexico, more final products. And then the final thing what I would say is also one of the things that happens when you have an emphasis on the domestic working class is that you end up actually uplifting the domestic middle class, and you end up building a bigger domestic market, which was something that actually was not the priorities of the neoliberal administrations. They were very much export oriented. And here there's more of an emphasis on selling to a domestic market, which is also positive news in terms of the economic front. But all that to say that there are still, even though, yes, Mexico under López Obrador and likely under Claudia Sheinbaum placing its bets on the North American economic relationship, there are now more possibilities for trade to the south, to the rest of Latin America, but also to the east, to Asia.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Janet Cohen.
Yes, thank you, José Luis, for your very informative presentation and for your work. I have a few questions. I'll just ask them and feel free to answer them, or some of them as time allows. But first, I'd just like to mention that I've been confused about the Spanish conquest of Mexico 500 years ago, and that Mexico was a colonized country like the US was, and thus I wonder who Mexicans really are relative to the indigenous population of that land. In any case, I'll go to my questions. So Mexico has voted for in favor of UN resolutions for ceasefires in Gaza. Can you talk about Mexico's foreign policy, including its position on Ukraine, its relationship with Russia and China, and also about joining BRICS? Big question, I know. Also, what is the status of Mexico's military, and how would Mexico fight any US intervention militarily? And finally, whatever happened to those, was it 40 students who were disappeared years ago? And related to that, can you talk about the crime in Mexico, or just about crime in Mexico, its police and police corruption? Also a big question.
Sure. Okay. You might have to remind me because I didn't write them down. But on the first thing around the form of colonialism, I think the form that colonialism took here in Mexico was different from the United States. I think there are much better scholars on this than I am. But what happened here was a sort of a mestizaje, a mixture, right? Particularly because the indigenous population was so large, and also the strategy in most of North America, as to say Canada, what is today Canada and the US, was to displace the indigenous population, whereas here it was to turn them into a workforce. And I think that's a big difference. And then that's kind of emerged or developed very differently, right? Sort of the center of the country, which is always like the heart of economic and political power, is very much, mestizos, like me, right? Where I have a grandmother who's Zapatec, but also a grandfather who's Spanish, right? Like just like a very big mixture of people. There is a renewed push to kind of celebrate our indigenous roots, which in a way there was a deliberate kind of state-led effort to kind of erase that. La raza cósmica, I don't know if you've ever heard of that, the cosmic race, this idea that we're like, a race made up of all of this, but it was actually an effort to kind of erase indigenous identity. In the country's south, there's a very strong indigenous population, majority in places like Oaxaca, Chiapas, Guerrero, large Afro-descendant population, Veracruz and Guerrero. So ethnically, it's a very mixed, very diverse country. And then the sort of the north is a lot whiter. It's also kind of a lot culturally closer to the United States and things like that. Anyway, there's a lot to get into, but maybe I can find some stuff and share it with you at another point. You can always find me on social media, Granados Ceja, or my email, granadosceja@gmail.com. Send me a message and we can chat more. Around foreign policy. So Mexico has an independent foreign policy that it didn't have basically since the year 2000. Mexico's foreign policy is actually dictated by its constitution. And it's non-interference in foreign affairs and the affairs of other countries. And that obviously had changed under the neoliberal governments with Fox, starting with Fox and then followed by the rest of them, Calderón, Peña Nieto. But under López Obrador, and this is the one that I always point to bring up Venezuela again. So do you remember 2019 when the strategy was to recognize Juan Guaidó as the president, even though he never ran for president and nobody knew who he was, and just lifted his hand up in the plaza? The most ludicrous thing. But the strategy there, and because I followed Venezuela so closely, I was watching it unfold live. And there was obviously, this was a predetermined effort. It's not like Juan Guaidó did this and then asked people to recognize him later. There was obviously a strategy. These conversations happened long before he made that gesture in that public plaza in Caracas. And so there was a deliberate effort to try to convince the public that there was regional consensus on it. So they were like, oh, but Chile and Colombia and all these other countries have now recognized Juan Guaidó as the legitimate president of Venezuela. And you know who didn't? You know who's the first one to say, whoa, 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 whoa? It was Mexico. Mexico issues a statement at around 10:50, 11 a.m., around then, saying like, we don't agree with this at all. And that, I think, was critical to slowing that momentum. It seemed like I was watching and I was like, damn it, they're gonna succeed. This is gonna work. And I think Mexico's statement then, coming out of that moment, is what stopped that momentum and ultimately actually stopped Guaidó from being able to consolidate his position.
So I don't want to fall asleep.
Anyway, so that's an example of Mexico's independent foreign policy. The rescue of Salac, which I just talked about, its position on the conflict in Ukraine. So what Mexico has done is basically kind of try to put itself in a neutral position, which is funny because according to the logic of the Western world, a neutral position is a pro-Russia position. And in fact, there's this hilarious, totally out of touch correspondent, Mexican woman, Dolia Esteves, based out of Washington, who has Beltway brain. And it's like, oh, the pro-Russian, like Mexico isn't necessarily pro-Russia in any real sense. They don't even have that close of a relationship, right? But Mexico wasn't going to join the whole US-Europe-led campaign of isolation of Putin over an invasion of Ukraine in the way that they wanted it to. And so they kind of played this narrative. But I actually think that is the correct position, right? To advocate for a peaceful resolution to that conflict. Likewise, in the case of Palestine, I think Mexico has been trying to, they supported the case, not at the ICJ, at the ICC, with Chile for some accountability over the genocide that's happening there. I think the key pressure that movements here in Mexico have been pushing is to break relationship with Israel. Mexico has not broken diplomatic or economic relationship with Israel, to my disappointment, but has been consistently calling for an immediate permanent ceasefire at the Security Council and all this kind of stuff. And these are all things that I think if the opposition parties, or if this had happened, both Ukraine and Palestine had happened under Peña Nieto, you would have seen Peña Nieto follow the Washington line, the Washington position, the Brussels position on this. And so the independent foreign policy is really important in that sense. I think has been very consequential in terms of protecting sovereignty in the region, right? With the defense of SALAC, with the defense of Maduro's legitimate mandate, as just an example of some of the cases. I think one of the key tests right now will be what happens in Haiti, right? Like, you know, there's a very strong push for it to be partners, quote unquote, in Latin America to engage in that yet another military occupation of Haiti. So hopefully Mexico takes the correct position there and opposes it as they should.
And the military?
Oh, yes, thank you. So the military is a very complicated answer, and that would require a presentation on its own, because the truth is that the military has extraordinary power. You asked at the very end around the 43 students. So the 43 students from the Ayotzinapa Teachers College, they were forcibly disappeared by the state. The under López Obrador, the Truth Commission established that it was a crime by the state. And really the issue now is that the parents of the disappeared students, they want to know what happened to their kids, and they want to know what the military did. What was their involvement? And the military, despite orders from the presidency, has refused to really open up their files to explain what was their role, what did they know, because the Ayotzinapa students were being followed basically the entire time. The armed forces, the army in general, because they have a barracks nearby, knew the whole incident that was going on from the very beginning, from when they were first shot at, when they were detained, when they were disappeared, and then it starts to get murky in terms of what happened. But they conceivably know, and they refuse to tell. And that I bring that up because it tells you the power of the armed forces in this country. They are kind of like a parastate living on top of the regular state. And it's extraordinary just how much influence and power that they have. López Obrador's strategy has been to placate them with money, which is like, behave, don't commit a coup, because that's a very real threat, right? Don't carry out a coup, you know, respect the Constitution, and I'll keep feeding you projects and money and all this kind of stuff. So they're involved with customs, they built the new airport, they're involved with the train. There's all these kinds of projects that they're directly involved with, and it's to kind of keep them happy. And they are happy, right? The armed forces are very much, you know, they're not conspiring the way that they definitely do in other circumstances. And so it reduces the risk of a unconstitutional break in order in this country. But it comes at a price, which is that the word would be impunity. There's a lot of impunity around the armed forces. And the truth is, the only way we'll be able to kind of lift that impunity is through the kinds of mass mobilization that we saw back in 2014 when the students were forced disappeared. There is no movement right now to confront the power of the armed forces as it stands in this country. And I don't think without that kind of extra parliamentary struggle on the streets demanding this and putting pressure on the state to actually do it and to face the consequences of doing that, I don't think we're going to get there.
Could you put your contact information into the chat?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Jose Luis. We're definitely going to have to come back because you're just scratching the surface, and I think everybody wants to hear, especially about the role of the foreign policy thing. We're just about nearing our time limit. I know Lucy Rios has had her hand up from the very, very beginning. So for sure, we're going to ask Lucy to ask a question, but the other two hands, I'm going to apologize and say we're going to have to put that off to the next time Jose Luis comes back, if you're willing to come back. But I think there's so much more to be heard from you. So Lucy Ruiz, the stage is all yours, and please unmute yourself.
Oh, yes, hello. Thank you so much for inviting me. I don't know if you can hear me?
Perfectly.
Oh, okay. Okay. No, I just wanted to ask Jose. Jose, wonderful presentation. I loved it. Yeah, I'm an immigrant, like so many of us Latinos here in this country. We came from Mexico, pero some people are actually natives, like the people in Nuevo Mexico that never immigrated. They were here, they were invaded. But at any rate, the question I had was related to BRICS. I was curious because it seems to me that Mexico has to defend itself from from this big imperialist power, and there is an emerging global South that is coming out, and there are forces that are moving in two directions, and there is a very fear of the future, I think, but also positive things. And I'm really happy about Mexico in the direction it's going. Yeah, but I just wanted to ask a question about BRICS, and you answered the question, I think. But anyway, yeah, no, I live in Texas, and híjole, we're in the worst place in the world towards immigrants. There is a deep historical hatred against immigrantes, and they face very rabid racism against Mexicanos, and yeah, we've lived it here. So anyway, yeah, that was it.
Okay. Yeah. No, thank you so much for your comments. You know, it's always nice to connect with other people who migrated, because like I mentioned, so I was born here in Mexico, but we left when I was 2 years old. Like I was a toddler. We left for New Jersey and then Arizona. Right. And it's actually, it's in a very weird thing about life is that I probably would not have become a socialist had it not been for all the racism I experienced in Arizona, because it made me pay attention to politics, right? I was like, I remember being a kid and being like, why is things so much harder for me? Like, why are there more barriers, right? I didn't have the language quite right, but I remember understanding, feeling that. And I had a very patient teacher when I was 15. He's like, well, racism is responding to a certain need to create this underclass, right? They want, like, you know, the white supremacist elite doesn't want somebody like you rising too much. And then it all started kind of making sense, and you asked the right questions, and then the invasion of Iraq and all this kind of stuff kind of made me become a socialist. Anyway, all that to say is that I was also very blown away by how much the community has grown in terms of its ability to project its political power. Like I was in Los Angeles, and you know, it was funny because I was talking to my partner. I was like, oh, I'm going to go to the US and I'm going to be speaking English, and you know, I don't really have the opportunity to speak English on a daily basis, really. But then we were together in Los Angeles, and I'd forgotten that, you know, this was an English-speaking country, because I would go to the supermarket and everybody would just talk to me in Spanish, and it was kind of an extraordinary thing, right? And there's a lot of political power to that. One of the things I also say is that, to paraphrase Tariq Ali, is that back in the first pink tide, you know, in the early 2000s, there was this notion that one of the ways that maybe socialist thought will creep its way into the United States will be through the Latin American population, because they'll be able to speak to their experiences from their family members or back home and all these kinds of things. And I continue to believe that that's very possible, right? Like I said this to another person as well, like that, you know, there's a reason people don't know about what's happening in Mexico, because they might be inspired and take the right lessons from it. And there's a lot of people who are afraid of that kind of thing happening. And I think there's a lot of power in being a migrant. Plus, like I said, in the same way that US needs Mexican labor, they need migrant labor. They need us as much as, like, we're the creators of wealth as workers, but I think of migrant workers in particular. And then just now, you asked about BRICS. I looked it up. The exact quote from the foreign minister was, México sigue con interés el desarrollo del bloque por el peso económico de las naciones que lo conforman y los intercambios bilaterales que nuestro país mantiene con sus miembros. Which is, so Mexico is following with interest the development of the BRICS bloc for its economic weight of the countries that make up that bloc, and for the bilateral exchanges that our country has with some of the members. And so, you know, it's kind of like, we're not going to join BRICS, but we like it. But I think also strategically thinking, right, the fact that there is an alternative, that there is another block available, really allows you to negotiate far more, right? Like, a lot of things happen. I'm not in the government. I've never been in these negotiating rooms, but I've interviewed people who have, right? And they tell me they're like, you'd be surprised at how far we can push things because we're at the table. For example, and this will be the last thing I'll say on this comment, the USMCA has a chapter in it So despite the fact that that was renegotiated under the previous regime, because the election happened in July, López Obrador got to send negotiators to input on the final draft of the USMCA. And there's a chapter that explicitly recognizes Mexico's right, inalienable right, to develop its natural resources, oil in particular, and to modify its constitution. And that's in a free trade agreement. So it shows you just how far you can get, even when you're negotiating with the big bully on the scene. Because I think also they understand that, like, if it doesn't go, hey, we can start really pushing towards a closer relationship with China as the emerging superpower. So it's very advantageous. And I think that quote from the foreign minister kind of sums it up. This makes sense. These countries have economic weight. You know, we're not going to join just yet, but, you know, it's nice to know it exists.
Oh, all right.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And thank you, everybody, for coming and joining us at the Marxist Library. Look forward to seeing you next week. And Jose Luis.
Hey, Roger, we have one more. I'll stick around for one more minute. I don't want to leave one last person hanging. Is that okay?
Okay, sure.
Sure, one more person. We'll keep it quick.
Carol.
Yeah, Carol. We don't want to leave you out.
Oh, thank you so much. What I really wanted to know is about your podcast again, because
sure.
I think it would be wonderful.
Great.
What's the name of it again?
I'll put it in the chat. So it's the Soberanía podcast. It's in English, although I usually do the effort of trying to put in the subtitles in Spanish. So they're like auto-translated, but they're pretty close. So it's called Soberanía. It comes out bi-weekly, but we also do like clips and stuff like that. We did a live report last Friday, so 8 days ago, right after the demo to kick off the rally. But it's an opportunity for us to try to get information in an accessible way as much as possible in English, because that's the audience we're trying to reach. As folks like yourselves based in the United States, to try to explain things in a way. We always try to kind of keep that in mind, that maybe we're talking to an audience that's not that familiar with Mexico. So we'll, you know, go through the effort of explaining who's who every single time. But yeah, please, the best thing would be to please share it with your friends, share it with your family members. We do a video format on YouTube, but it's also on Apple and on Spotify. Apple Podcasts and Spotify Podcasts as an audio version as well. Again, so the idea is that it's kind of a way for us to answer what's happening kind of in the moment as fast as possible in terms of the country, but also follow Mexico Solidarity Media, where we're also covering news development as well. And I'm happy to share that I'll also be publishing in Al Jazeera as well. So hopefully that'll help us get some more of a bigger audience as well. And we'll be reprinting those as well.
Well, thank you so much.
For that question. And
I'm so glad we had a chance to connect. This was great.
And ciao to everybody. Goodbye.
Institute for the Critical Study of Society at the Niebuhr Proctor Marxist Library receives no corporate funding, nor do we have any paid staff. We rely on the support of working class folks that share our commitment to the socialist legacy of Karl Marx. We continue to need funds to meet necessary expenses, since we can no longer pass the hat at our in-person forums. Please send contributions to our treasurer, either online via PayPal or by check. The PayPal ID is ICSS Sunday, SUNDAY, at yahoo.com. And the name is Richard Fallenbaum. And checks may be made out to Richard Fallenbaum and sent to him at 1225 Nielsen Street, Berkeley, California, 94706. Fallenbaum is spelled Fallenbaum. To donate directly to the Marxist Library, send a check to the Niebuhr Proctor Marxist Library at 6501 Telegraph Avenue, Oakland, California, 94609, or directly or donate online at www.paypal.me/npml. For information, write to npml at marxistlibr.org, and the website is marxistlibr.org.